Eliza had always loved the old mansion on the hill. It had been abandoned for years, its stone walls cracked with age, ivy creeping up like nature's fingers, but there was something about it that intrigued her. She had spent many summers playing near the edge of its grounds, but today was different. Today she was going inside. As she pushed open the rusted gate, a chill ran down her spine. The air was heavier here, thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark windows like eyes staring into her soul. With a deep breath, Eliza stepped onto the worn path that led to the front door. The wooden panels creaked as she approached, and the door, as if waiting for her, swung open with a groan. She hesitated, but curiosity pushed her forward. Inside, the air was stale, the dust thick in the air. Her footsteps echoed through the cavernous hallway as she explored room after room. The place was a mess, old furniture overturned, papers scattered, and shattered glass glittering on the floor. Yet, in some strange way, it felt alive, as if something was watching her from the corners of the rooms. It wasn't until Eliza reached the staircase that she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being followed. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. She laughed nervously, chalking it up to her imagination, but something was off. The house was too silent, too still. Climbing the stairs, Eliza noticed a faint whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. She paused, straining to hear. The voices were coming from the walls themselves, murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. She was about to turn back when she saw it. A shadow at the end of the hallway, just past the door to the master bedroom. The shadow was tall, its form barely discernible in the darkness. It moved slowly, gliding toward her with unnatural grace. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the house was alive with the voices of the past. The shadow reached the doorway and paused, staring at her with hollow eyes. Eliza couldn't look away, mesmerized and terrified at the same time. The figure raised its hand, a long, bony finger pointing directly at her. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the whispering turned into a cacophony of voices screaming in agony. Suddenly, the shadow lunged forward, and Eliza felt an icy grip close around her wrist. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull away, but the hand was strong, its touch cold as death itself. The shadow spoke in a voice that sent chills down her spine, words she didn't understand but felt deep in her soul. "You should never have come here." With a final, desperate scream, Eliza tore herself free and ran down the stairs, the shadow following, its footsteps echoing behind her. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls bending and shifting, the whispering voices louder than ever. She stumbled through the front door, her heart racing as she fled into the night. But when she looked back, the mansion was still there, unchanged. The door was open, the shadow waiting, and the whispers had followed her. Always there, always watching. Eliza stumbled into the moonlit forest, her breath ragged, her mind racing. She couldn't understand what had just happened. The shadow, the voices, the cold grip, it had all felt so real. Yet, when she glanced back at the mansion, the same eerie stillness had returned. The door stood wide open, inviting her to return, but she knew better now. The house was not abandoned. It was alive, and it was waiting. She ran, her feet pounding against the earth, the weight of dread clinging to her like a second skin. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted, as if they too were reaching for her. The whispering followed her, faint at first like a murmur in the wind, but it soon grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the voices were calling her name. Eliza, Eliza. Her name echoed from every direction, bouncing off the trees and seeping into her mind. She tried to ignore it to keep running, but the sound was inescapable. It was as if the forest itself was alive, shifting, moving with a purpose. Her legs burned and her lungs ached for air, but she couldn't stop. She had to get away. But the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate steps that never seemed to get closer, but always remained just out of sight. Her pulse quickened as she glanced over her shoulder, but saw nothing. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. A silence fell over the forest, thick and heavy. Eliza dared not move, her body frozen with terror. It was then that she realized the air had grown unnaturally cold. She could see her breath, misting in front of her face. The darkness seemed to shift, twisting and warping, as though the night itself was alive. Suddenly the figure appeared. It was not the same shadow she had seen in the mansion, but something far worse. This one was tall, its body a mass of blackness, as if it were made of the shadows themselves. Its face was a void, hollow and empty, save for two glowing red eyes that burned with an otherworldly hunger. It moved toward her with terrifying speed, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. The whispers had stopped. The forest had fallen silent. Only the sound of Eliza's heart pounding in her ears filled the air. "Eliza!" The voice was a rasp, low and guttural, like 1,000 souls trapped in one body. "You cannot escape me." Eliza backed away, her legs shaking, her throat dry. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure loomed closer, its red eyes never leaving hers. "Why me?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The shadow tilted its head, as if considering her question. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached out a hand. Its fingers were long and slender, like the branches of a dead tree, and as they brushed against her skin, she felt the cold seep into her bones. The touch was like ice, sending a jolt of terror through her entire body. "Because you awakened me," it whispered. "You should have never come back." The words sent a shiver of realization through Eliza. She had always been drawn to the mansion, as if it called to her, but she had never understood why. Now, standing face to face with this thing, she knew that her curiosity had been the catalyst. She had unwittingly disturbed something ancient, something that had been waiting for her all along. With a final, horrifying screech, the shadow lunged at her, its fingers closing around her throat. The world around her blurred as she struggled to break free, but the grip was like iron, unyielding. "Eliza!" Her vision darkened, and her body grew cold. The last thing she saw was the mansion on the hill, its windows glowing with an eerie light, as though the house itself was watching her final moments. And then everything went black. The next morning, the forest was silent again. The only traces of Eliza were the faintest footprints in the dirt, leading toward the mansion. But no one would ever find her, for the house had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. And the whispering would continue forever, reaching out to anyone who dared to listen. Days passed, and the forest outside the mansion seemed to return to its normal, quiet existence. The villagers who lived nearby spoke in hushed tones about the strange happenings on the hill, but no one dared venture close. The mansion, as always, stood in isolation, its windows darkened like eyes that refused to blink. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, as if the earth itself had absorbed the fear that now clung to the mansion. The trees seemed to bend closer to the ground, their branches reaching, straining toward the house in unnatural angles. And at night, the whispering began again, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze, but soon growing louder, more desperate. "Eliza!" The voice was faint, a mere breath carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. Liza's name. No one knew what had happened to her. No one knew the true horrors that had unfolded within the mansion's walls. But there were those who had heard the whispers, the faint cries carried from the direction of the hill. Some believed it was the voice of the house itself, calling for more souls to claim. Among those who had heard the whispers was Michael. He had grown up in the village and had often heard the tales of the haunted mansion, stories of strange lights, strange noises, and the spirits of those who had never returned. But he had always dismissed them as mere folklore, stories told to frighten children. Till now, Michael had been close to Eliza. They had been friends since childhood, their bond forged in the forests and fields that surrounded the village. When she disappeared, he was devastated. He couldn't accept that she had simply vanished. There had to be more to it, something that no one was willing to speak of. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the mansion in the distance. The whispering had been growing louder for days, and he could no longer ignore it. He had to know the truth. He had to find Eliza. With a heavy heart, he set off toward the mansion, his footsteps crunching on the dry earth. As he approached, the air grew colder, and the whispering grew louder, surrounding him from every direction. The voices were not just calling Eliza's name now. They were beckoning him as well. Michael. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He recognized the voice. It was Eliza's. Come closer. Without thinking, he moved toward the mansion, his heart pounding in his chest. The door was open, just as it had been when Eliza first entered. It seemed to invite him in, as though it had been waiting for him all along. Inside, the mansion was just as he remembered from his childhood. Dark, decaying, and silent. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under his weight. But there was something else now. A presence, heavy and oppressive, lingered in every corner. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing. Eliza, Michael called, his voice shaking. There was no answer at first, just the sound of his own breathing, ragged and uncertain. But then, from the darkness, came a faint movement. Shadow. It flickered in and out of sight, moving just at the edge of his vision. Michael felt a chill crawl up his spine as he followed the movement, his legs heavy with dread. Eliza. He whispered again, his voice barely audible. The shadow turned toward him, and Michael's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Eliza. It was something else, something much darker. The figure stepped out from the shadows, its form hazy and indistinct, like smoke taking shape. Its eyes were two hollow pits of darkness, its face a grotesque mask of twisted features that seemed to shift with every blink. The air grew colder still, and Michael's heart skipped a beat as the figure spoke in a voice that was not Eliza's, but something far more ancient. You should not have come here, Michael, the voice rasped. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, as if the mansion itself was alive with the voices of the lost. Michael's legs shook, but he couldn't turn away. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, its gaze piercing into his very soul. You are the next, it said, its voice a cacophony of the tortured souls that had been claimed before him. The mansion will have you, just as it has taken the others. Michael tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if the house was holding him in place, trapping him within its walls. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and claw-like, and Michael felt the ice-cold touch settle over his heart. Eliza, he whispered, his voice breaking. Where is she? The figure's eyes burned with a cold, malevolent light. She is here, it said, its voice echoing in the silence. And now you will join her. The last thing Michael saw before the darkness consumed him was the faint silhouette of Eliza, standing at the end of the hallway, her face twisted in agony. Her eyes, once full of life, were now hollow, empty, and she too was a shadow, a mere echo of the person she had once been. The mansion had claimed another soul. The morning after Michael disappeared, the village remained eerily quiet. The gossip about the mansion's curse had circulated once more, but this time, there was something different in the air. The villagers, who once dismissed the eerie stories, now began to wonder whether the old tales were true. Whispers of Michael's disappearance quickly spread, though no one dared venture up the hill to investigate. But the house, it knew, the mansion was never empty. As the days passed, the wind grew colder, and the whispering never ceased. It had become a constant murmur, a hum that vibrated in the bones of those who dared to listen. It was as if the mansion had found new voices, voices that were not just Eliza's and Michael's, but all of those who had entered and never returned. Even the trees seemed to bend toward the house now, as if drawn by an invisible force. The forest was no longer a sanctuary for the village, but a silent witness to the horrors that lay beyond. The mansion was never far from anyone's thoughts, its dark shape looming in the distance, a reminder of the power it held. One evening, a new figure appeared at the edge of the village. Traveler, a stranger. His clothes were worn, his face weathered by years of wandering, but his eyes were bright and curious, as if seeking something, or perhaps running from something. The villagers paid him little mind, only offering him a place to stay for the night, not knowing that he carried with him the same fatal curiosity that had already claimed too many others. As night fell, the wind picked up, and the whispering began once again, creeping into the stranger's ears. The voices were faint at first, like whispers in a dream, but as he tried to fall asleep, they grew louder. They called to him, soft, sweet, and insistent. "Come closer." The traveler tried to block it out, turning over in bed, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, curling around him like smoke, tugging at his consciousness. Then they grew darker, more urgent. "Help us!" He shot upright, his heart racing. There was something out there, something waiting. The urge to investigate was overpowering, pulling at the core of his being, as if his very soul was being tugged. He had heard the rumors, of course, the tales of the mansion on the hill, the cursed house that claimed the lost, but he had never believed them. Not until now. Now he could feel it, the weight of the house calling to him from the distance. Unable to resist, the traveler dressed quickly, grabbing a lantern from the corner of the room. He stepped out into the night, the wind howling around him, the trees groaning under the pressure. The whispering grew louder, clearer now. Eliza, Michael. The names of the lost souls echoed through the night, and the traveler could not help but follow. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him up the narrow path toward the mansion. The fog had settled low to the ground, swirling around his ankles, and the air felt thick, heavy with unseen eyes. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere now, surrounding him, suffocating him. As he approached the mansion's front door, the air turned ice-cold, and he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Still he opened the door. The house creaked, its ancient timbers groaning as if alive. Inside, the house was exactly as the villagers had described. Frozen in time, abandoned and rotting, yet somehow alive. The traveler stepped inside, the lantern casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers were deafening now, overwhelming his mind, but there was something else, something deeper in the house. A presence, darker than the whispers, waiting in the depths. The traveler couldn't explain it, but he felt it in his bones. And then he saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was tall, wrapped in shadow, its face obscured by darkness. It stared at him with empty eyes, and the whispers fell silent. The traveler's heart skipped a beat. The figure spoke, its voice low and ancient, as if it had been waiting for him for centuries. "You've come. You are the next." The words cut through the stillness, and the air grew colder still. The lantern flickered in the traveler's hand, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. The figure stepped forward, its form shifting, becoming more distinct, more real. Its features twisted and contorted, as if the darkness itself was forming a new face, one that was not quite human. The traveler took a step back, his mind racing. He turned, but the hallway stretched endlessly before him. The door was no longer visible. He was trapped. Who are you?" the traveler stammered. "I am the house. I am the voice of those who have come before you. I am the shadow that waits," the figure whispered, its voice rising with a haunting, hollow echo. "You thought you could escape, but now you belong to me. As Eliza did. As Michael did. As they all did." A cold hand reached out from the darkness, its fingers long and bony, the tips sharp as knives. The traveler tried to run, but his legs were frozen, his body unwilling to obey. The whispers returned, louder, frantic, as the shadow's hand wrapped around his throat, pulling him closer. "No!" the traveler screamed. "I don't want this." The shadow's grin widened, its face now fully visible, a grotesque, twisted mockery of a human's. Its eyes gleamed with malice, its teeth sharp and jagged. "You never had a choice," it hissed. With a final, desperate cry, the traveler was pulled into the darkness. And just like that, the mansion claimed another soul. The whispers began again, now with the voice of the traveler joining the chorus. The house was never empty. It never would be again. The morning after the traveler disappeared, the village was still, the air heavy with an unsettling calm. The villagers, aware of the strange occurrences but unwilling to speak of them aloud, went about their daily routines. Yet something had shifted. A sense of dread seemed to hang in the air, thicker than ever before. The mansion, which had always stood as a distant, forgotten relic, now felt like a living thing, its presence far too close. As the sun began to set, an unexpected visitor arrived in the village. A woman, her face pale and drawn, walked slowly along the main road. Her clothes were old, worn, as if she had been traveling for days. Her name was Agnes, and she had heard the stories of the mansion long ago. But it wasn't the stories that brought her here. It was the letters. She had received one just a week before, a letter from her brother, the same brother who had gone missing years ago. The letter was vague, written in hurried, cryptic handwriting, but one line stood out. "Help me. The house is not what it seems." Agnes had barely been able to breathe as she read the words. It was a call for help, a plea she could never ignore. She had to find him. She had to discover what had happened to him, to understand why the mansion had claimed so many lives. And so she had come. The villagers, seeing her approach, gave her a wide berth. They had seen too many like her. Too many who had entered the mansion only to vanish without a trace. But Agnes was different. She wasn't like the others who had come seeking adventure or curiosity. She had a purpose. And nothing, not even the thickening gloom surrounding the mansion, would stop her from finding out what had happened to her brother. As the last light of day faded, Agnes made her way to the base of the hill. The mansion loomed above her, its dark silhouette standing against the sky, a monstrous figure that seemed to draw the very night to itself. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest whispers, voices twisted and broken, calling out to her. "Come closer." Agnes shuddered, but she pressed on. Her brother's face flashed in her mind, and she quickened her pace. She had to get inside. She had to know what had happened. When she reached the front door, she hesitated. It was wide open, as if inviting her in, but there was no warmth, no safety in that invitation. Only cold, suffocating darkness. The house seemed to breathe, its walls creaking, its shadows shifting unnaturally. Still, Agnes stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the whispers grew louder. At first, they were distant, like a murmur in the wind. But soon they surrounded her. Voices rising from the floor, the walls, the very air. They called her name, beckoned her deeper into the house. Agnes, Agnes. Her heart raced as she moved forward, the lantern in her hand flickering, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. Each step she took seemed to pull her further from the world she knew, drawing her into the house's suffocating grasp. She found herself standing in the grand hallway, its once beautiful wallpaper peeling away, revealing the rotting wood beneath. The air smelled of mildew, of decay, of something far worse. And yet it smelled familiar. It was a smell she had known from her childhood, a smell that had been present the last time she had seen her brother, before he had disappeared. "James," she called, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was thick with expectation, as if the house itself was listening, waiting. And then a soft sound reached her ears, a faint rustling like someone moving in the next room. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him. Had to be. She followed the noise, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more frantic as she neared the source. She rounded a corner and froze. There in the doorway stood a figure. It was her brother, but it wasn't. His eyes were wide, hollow, as if the life had been drained from him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth moved, but no sound came out. His limbs were stiff, unnaturally so, as if he were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. "James," Agnes whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "Is it really you?" The figure lifted its head slowly, its mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped. Agnes took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure advanced slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You will join us now," it said, its voice a hollow echo of her brother's. "The house demands it." In an instant, the figure lunged at her, its cold, skeletal hands reaching for her. She screamed, finally finding her legs, and stumbled backward, crashing into the wall. She scrambled to her feet, panic flooding her veins. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the air thick with the sound of hundreds of voices, screaming, whispering, pleading. The figure that had once been her brother reached out again, but this time Agnes was faster. She turned and ran, her footsteps slamming against the floor, her breath ragged as she fled down the hallway. But no matter where she went, the house kept shifting, distorting, twisting into impossible shapes. There were no doors, no exits, just walls, just shadows. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot leave. You belong to us now." And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, the door that had once been sealed shut was now wide open. Beyond it lay only darkness. Agnes hesitated for a moment, but then, with no other choice, she ran toward it. The figure followed, its footsteps heavy behind her, its voice growing louder as it reached for her once more. Just as she reached the door, the whispers reached a crescendo, and the figure lunged, its cold hands brushing against her skin. But as she stepped through the doorway, everything went still. The house had stopped. For a moment there was no sound, no movement. just a thick silence. And then she realized. The door had closed behind her, and she was no longer in the mansion. She was in a place somewhere else. A place of endless darkness, where the air was thick with an oppressive weight. But she wasn't alone. The whispers began again, soft at first. "Welcome, Agnes." She turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror, for she knew now that she had never truly left the mansion. It had simply taken her somewhere darker, somewhere it could keep her forever. The house had claimed another soul, and the whispers would never end. Agnes stood still in the suffocating darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. The door had vanished behind her, and the silence that followed felt like a heavy weight pressing against her chest. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the sound of her breath and the steady beat of her own heart. But she wasn't alone. She could feel it. Something was watching her from the shadows. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence. A cold wind blew through the darkness, carrying with it the faintest traces of voices, whispers just beyond her reach. They weren't clear at first, just disjointed fragments. But as they grew louder, they began to form words. "Agnes, you are not alone." She spun around, her pulse racing, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the endless blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. But the voices were getting closer now. She could almost feel them against her skin, like 1,000 invisible hands brushing against her. Who are you?" Agnes whispered, her throat dry, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. "Join us." The words seemed to echo from all directions, and she could feel the weight of them pressing on her soul. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were a chorus, a cacophony of souls trapped within the mansion. And she understood, finally, what they were trying to tell her. This place, this house, was more than just a structure. It was a prison, a place where the lost souls of the past had been trapped, bound by the house's insidious power. "James," she whispered, her voice choked with grief. "Where are you? What happened to you?" The darkness seemed to shift around her, its oppressive weight growing heavier, suffocating her with each passing second. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, as though the house itself was alive, moving and shifting, drawing her deeper into its dark heart. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. Agnes held her breath, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds at all. Until, in the far distance, she saw it. Faint light, flickering in the distance. It was the soft glow of a lantern, its light feeble and uncertain. She knew, without a doubt, that it was her brother, James. He had to be the one holding it. "James!" she cried, her voice echoing through the darkness. Without thinking, she began to run, her footsteps echoing in the stillness, the light growing brighter with each passing second. Her heart raced as she pushed forward, the hope of finding him driving her onward. But as she neared the light, it began to fade. "James, wait!" she screamed. The light flickered, dimming until it was nothing but a distant speck in the vast, endless dark. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. Agnes stopped, her breath ragged. She felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't give in to the house. Not now. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something move. A shadow, fleeting, like a flicker of movement in the corner of her vision. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the cold, empty darkness stretching out in every direction. But the whispering returned, this time louder, more frantic. "Agnes, he's not here. He's never been here." The words were like daggers, cutting into her mind, filling her with doubt and terror. Was it possible? Had she been chasing a ghost? A figment of her imagination? Was James truly lost to her? Or was the house toying with her, feeding her hope only to tear it away? The shadows shifted again, this time coalescing into something more tangible. The air grew colder, and the temperature seemed to drop rapidly, as if the very essence of the house was draining the warmth from her body. And then she saw him, James, but it wasn't really him. He stood before her, his face twisted in agony, his eyes hollow and empty, as if his soul had been hollowed out by the house. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were not his own. They were the voices of all the lost souls, all the victims who had perished within these walls. Agnes, help me. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she stumbled, reaching out toward him, her heart aching with the hope that she could somehow save him. But as she moved closer, his form began to distort, his body flickering like a broken image on a screen. His face twisted in pain, contorting into something monstrous, something other, and then with a sickening crack, his body shattered into 1,000 pieces, falling to the ground like dust. Agnes screamed, falling to her knees, the horror of what she had seen crashing down on her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world around her seemed to collapse, spinning into chaos. And then, as if the house itself had sensed her despair, the whispers returned, louder than ever. You cannot save him. You cannot save anyone. The floor beneath her began to shift, the ground trembling as the house seemed to come alive, its walls creaking and groaning. The whispers filled her ears, deafening, overwhelming, and suddenly, she felt her body being pulled from the ground, as if the house itself was reaching out to claim her. Her vision blurred, and she gasped for air, the darkness closing in on her. She could feel the cold hands of the house wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into its heart. She fought against it, but it was no use. The house had her now. You are ours, the voices hissed. You will never escape. Her last breath was a whisper, swallowed by the house. And so, Agnes joined the others, the countless souls who had been lost to the mansion over the centuries. The whispers would never cease, their voices forever echoing through the endless halls. The house would continue to claim the lost, feeding on their fear and despair, drawing in new victims with every passing year. The mansion was never empty. It would never be empty. Agnes felt herself sinking into an abyss, the darkness swallowing her whole. Her body, though still alive, seemed to lose all sense of self, as if the very essence of her being was being erased. The whispers, now a deafening chorus, filled every corner of her mind, every fiber of her soul. You belong to us now, they chanted, their voices merging into one, cold and merciless. Her eyes flickered open, but there was nothing but blackness. She didn't know where she was anymore. Was she still in the mansion? Had she crossed over into something worse? She could no longer tell. The walls, the floor, the very air, everything seemed to dissolve, leaving only the voices, the weight of their presence pressing down upon her. And then, amid the cacophony, a single voice broke through, faint, fragile, but unmistakable. Agnes! Her breath caught in her throat. It was James. Her James. His voice, so familiar, yet tinged with something unrecognizable, something darker. James! She whispered, her voice trembling. Is it really you? The darkness shifted. There, just before her, appeared a figure, a shadow, a silhouette, standing at the edge of her vision. She could barely make out the features, but she knew. It was him. She could feel it. It was the one thing she had been searching for all along. But as she reached out toward him, the figure flickered, its form shifting and twisting like smoke caught in the wind. Her brother's face morphed, becoming a grotesque version of itself, a twisted reflection of the truth she had known. His eyes, once full of life, were now hollow, empty sockets that stared into her very soul. "James!" she cried, her voice breaking. The figure's lips curled into a smile, a cruel, mocking smile. "You shouldn't have come," the voice rasped, the words no longer her brother's. They were the voices of the house, all of the voices that had been consumed by it over the years. "You wanted to save me, but you are too late." Agnes recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to escape, but the darkness held her fast, wrapping around her like chains. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if urging her to accept her fate. "You are a part of us now," the voice continued, "just as we are a part of you." The figure before her reached out, its hands elongated and cold, its fingers crooked like claws. It touched her arm, and the chill seeped into her skin, spreading through her veins like ice. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming silence that followed. The whispers had faded, leaving only the sensation of being trapped. Trapped in a place that wasn't quite real, but wasn't quite imaginary either. The house had taken everything from her. Her brother, her hope, her very sense of self. She was nothing now, just another lost soul, another whisper in the wind. The figure of her brother dissolved into the shadows, and for a moment, the world around her went still. The air was thick with the weight of eternity. And then a new voice, hers, spoke, though it wasn't her own. "Agnes!" It was her voice, but it wasn't. It echoed, distorted, as though it were coming from every corner of the house, from every darkened room. It was as if the house itself had absorbed her. And now, she was part of the whispers, part of the endless chorus that filled the mansion's decaying halls. "Welcome home," the voices murmured, their tones soft but chilling. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open. She felt herself falling, the darkness rushing upward to meet her. The house was alive, feeding on her fear, pulling her deeper into its core. It was never empty, never quiet. It thrived on the souls it consumed, and now it had claimed one more. As her body dissolved into the shadows, her final thoughts were not of her brother, or of the village, or of the life she had left behind. They were thoughts of something darker, something more terrifying. The house was eternal. It would never let go. And so, Agnes became one with the mansion. Another voice in the endless stream of whispers that would never cease. She was no longer a person, no longer a soul. She was part of the house, part of the dark, never-ending hunger that drew others into its grasp. The mansion remained, its presence as oppressive and alive as ever. It stood at the edge of the village, silent and waiting, its doors open to those who dared to enter. The whispers never stopped, never faded. And so, the cycle continued. The house waited. The shadows grew long. The lost souls called out, their voices rising in a chorus of despair, and the mansion absorbed them all, forever. Epilogue. Years passed, and the village continued to grow. The mansion, though a shadow of its former self, still stood on the hill, a dark silhouette against the sky. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children not to go near. But the whispers never stopped. They still carried on the wind, calling to those who would listen. And every once in a while, a traveler would arrive, weary and curious, drawn to the mansion by its dark allure. And when they entered, the whispers would beckon them inside, and the cycle would begin anew. The mansion was never empty, and it never would be again.